I only needed shelter, but that old thread winder was waiting for me.
She was 24 and alone. No office, no savings, no partner. Just a canvas bag and the odd $9 she had folded after selling her last notebook of designs. And with that amount, she bought a forgotten bobbin lace pillow studio in Ipswich, Essex County, Massachusetts, listed as vanished from records in 1987. The front roof had collapsed. The windows were boarded shut. Essex County condemned it in 1987 for demolition during the following spring restoration season. Inside, a cherrywood thread winder waited a hidden hollow compartment, unopened for decades, holding money and a letter that would change the direction of her life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Elena Marlowe had been weaving invisible threads her whole life without knowing it. She grew up near the quiet edges of Ipswich, where old salt air moved inland through fields and narrow roads lined with stone walls. As a child, Elena was the girl who noticed loose stitches on coats, broken seams on curtains, and the careful repairs her grandmother made before buying anything new. She learned early that damaged things were not always ruined. Sometimes they only needed patient hands. Her mother, Claire, worked long hours managing accounts for a small furniture company and believed stability came from numbers that could be measured. She loved Elena, but she worried about anything uncertain. Craft was a hobby. Business was practical. Dreams, in her view, needed a safer foundation. The person who understood Elena's hands was her grandmother, Beatrice Vale, a woman whose fingers carried small scars from decades of working linen thread. Every Saturday morning, Elena walked to Beatrice's narrow white cottage with a basket of bread, and they sat beside the eastern window where the light was strongest. Beatrice taught her bobbin lace the way some people taught old songs. She did not rush. She showed Elena how to place the parchment pattern on the lace pillow, how to set brass pins into the correct spaces, and how dozens of wooden bobbins could move together without becoming tangled. The small wooden pieces clicked against each other like quiet rain. Their ritual never changed. Tea first. Thread sorted second. Work after that. Beatrice kept boxes of linen from earlier generations, each one marked with careful handwriting. Some threads were nearly invisible, finer than Elena believed possible. The older woman would lift them gently and explain that strength did not always come from thickness. Anything made carefully can carry more than it appears able to hold. Elena remembered those words because Beatrice never said them like advice. She said them like a fact she had proven with her own hands. When Beatrice died, the cottage was emptied within weeks. Elena arrived too late to save the old lace pillows, the carved bobbins, and the notebooks filled with patterns passed down through the family. The boxes were gone. The tools were scattered. All Elena kept was the memory of the rhythm. Years later, Elena turned that memory into a business idea. She created a restoration project that combined heritage lace with modern textile design. She spent 4 years building plans, contacting museums, and creating samples. Her closest friend, Vivian Cross, became her business partner. Vivian was polished, confident, and always knew how to enter a room as if she already belonged there. At first, Elena believed that confidence balanced her own careful nature. Then the documents appeared. Vivian had registered the project under her own name. She had spoken with investors without Elena present. She had described Elena's designs as early concepts that needed professional direction. The company account Elena helped build was closed before she could access it. The final conversation happened in the office they once shared. Vivian placed Elena's storage box beside the door. It contained sketches, thread samples, and a photograph of Beatrice's hands working lace. "You are no longer part of this company." 8 words. Elena stood there holding the box while her mother arrived after receiving a message from Vivian. Claire looked at the floor, then at the paperwork on the desk. She did not defend Elena. She did not ask questions. She only quietly picked up her own coat. That silence stayed longer than Vivian's words. For 6 weeks, Elena moved through Massachusetts and New Hampshire with nowhere permanent to sleep. She spent 3 nights on a bench near a bus station in Lowell, 2 nights in a cheap room above a closed diner in Manchester, and several evenings in a public shelter outside Worcester where the lights stayed on all night. Her money disappeared slowly. $7 became $4 after food and transportation. $4 became $2 after washing clothes at a laundromat. The final coins disappeared on a cup of coffee and a newspaper she bought because she needed somewhere warm to sit. One rainy afternoon in Worcester, Elena walked into the public library and searched through the community notices board near the entrance. Most papers were advertisements for repairs, yard sales, and lost pets. Near the bottom was a faded card. OLD bobbin lace studio for sale. Structure damaged. Tools remain. $9. The address was in Ipswich. Elena read it twice. The price seemed impossible, but the description was not written like a bargain. It sounded like someone trying to remove a burden they no longer wanted to carry. The card mentioned an abandoned lace studio that had belonged to an older family line and had been scheduled for removal. She copied the address onto the back of an old receipt. The next morning, she used the last of her remaining strength to find a bus route north. She carried one bag, photograph of her grandmother, and the $9 that had somehow survived every loss. She did not know what waited behind that locked door. But she knew one thing. For the first time in weeks, she was walking towards something that had not been taken from her. The bus left before sunrise, carrying Elena north through roads that slowly changed from crowded streets into quieter stretches of farmland and old coastal towns. She sat beside the window with her canvas bag against her feet, watching stone walls pass through the morning fog. The journey was longer than the map suggested. After the final stop, Elena walked the remaining miles because the road toward the old property was not served by the local routes anymore. The air grew colder near the marshes. She spent one night inside an abandoned hay barn outside town, wrapped in her coat beneath an old wool blanket she found hanging from a beam. The thermometer nailed beside the barn door showed 18 degrees Fahrenheit. She woke before dawn because the cold had settled through the wooden floorboards. She folded the blanket, cleaned the small space she had used, and left the barn exactly as she found it. By late morning, she reached Ipswich. The town looked smaller than she remembered from old family stories. It had changed, but traces of its past remained in the narrow streets and weathered buildings. Elena passed the Harbour General Store, the Ipswich Grain Exchange, the Old Lantern Cafe, Whitmore Hardware, and Vale & Sons Dry Goods before reaching the county offices. The county clerk's building stood near the centre of town, a brick structure with tall windows and polished brass handles. Elena entered carrying her papers in both hands. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old wood and ink. A woman behind the counter looked up. She had silver hair pinned tightly at the back of her head and wore a small pair of reading glasses attached to a thin chain around her neck. A brass nameplate on the desk read, "Margaret Ellis, County Clerk." "Can I help you?" Margaret asked. Elena placed the listing notice down carefully. "I am here about the lace studio." The clerk studied the paper longer than Elena expected. "You understand this property has been condemned?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the county has scheduled removal because repairs may exceed the value?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the previous owners left behind materials that may not be usable?" "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the deed transfers the responsibility entirely to you?" "Yes, ma'am." Margaret removed her glasses and looked at Elena. Most people who came for abandoned properties arrived with excitement. They imagined forgotten treasures, easy repairs, or something waiting to reward them. Elena did not look excited. She looked like someone who had already lost everything once and was prepared to lose something again. The clerk opened the file. The deed was thin, too thin for a property with such a long history. She pressed the brass stamp into the ink pad and placed it firmly onto the document. The sound echoed across the quiet office. "Take Old Harbour Road east," Margaret said. "Continue past the last stone bridge. You will see 3 walnut trees beside the marsh. The property line begins there." Elena reached for the papers. Then Margaret stopped. "Your last name." Elena looked up. "What about it?" The clerk touched the edge of the old file. "Marlowe." The room became quiet. "I knew that name once." Elena waited. Margaret turned the file around. Inside was a handwritten note from decades earlier. "Beatrice Vale." Elena's fingers tightened around the deed. "She was my grandmother." Margaret looked toward the window. "Your grandmother was one of the last people in Ipswich who still made traditional bobbin lace by hand. She came here every winter to record patterns before they disappeared." Elena had never heard that. "Why did nobody tell me?" Margaret folded the papers together. Sometimes families keep things because they believe they are protecting them. Sometimes they keep them because they do not know how to let them go. The walk to the property took nearly an hour. Old Harbour Road narrowed into a gravel path bordered by tall grass and low stone walls. A farmer named Samuel Reed passed with a brown dog following behind him. He lifted a hand but did not stop. The dog paused, studied Elena, then continued beside him. At the end of the path stood the walnut trees. Beyond them was the studio. The building was smaller than Elena imagined. It was a 1-story wooden structure, approximately 30 feet long and 20 feet wide, built with hand-cut pine boards darkened by more than a century of weather. The roof sagged near the western side. The chimney leaned slightly but remained standing. Above the door hung a faded wooden sign, "Vale Lace Workroom." Elena touched the letters. The door opened with resistance. Inside, the first thing she noticed was the smell. Old linen, dry wood, dust. The second was the sound. A loose board beneath her foot gave a long, tired creak. The third was the feeling of cold air moving through cracks in the walls. The fourth was the sight of dozens of lace pillows covered beneath grey cloth. The fifth was the silence. Not empty silence. Waiting silence. She spent that first evening clearing a small space near the back wall. She swept enough dust away to place her blanket on the floor. Her dinner was a piece of bread and the last apple she carried from town. Before sleeping, Elena lit a small candle beside her grandmother's photograph. The flame moved whenever the wind entered through the damaged boards. She watched it until her eyes grew heavy. And in that forgotten room, surrounded by unfinished patterns and quiet wooden tools, Elena finally rested. Some things look like small gestures and turn out to be everything. The first 3 days were not spent imagining what the studio could become. They were spent learning what it already was. Elena began with the things that could not wait. The old hand pump behind the building needed cleaning before it could provide water. The outhouse door had swollen shut from years of moisture, and she worked the hinges loose with oil from a small bottle she found beneath the workbench. She also learned the floor. Every board had its own sound. The plank near the entrance groaned under weight. The one beside the eastern window clicked slightly before settling. By the 3rd morning, Elena could cross the room before sunrise without waking herself fully. On the 4th day, she walked into town carrying a broken hinge, 2 loose nails, and a question. Whitmore Hardware sat between the grain exchange and the old ferry road. It was not a large store, but every wall held something useful. Wooden drawers filled with screws lined one side. Coils of rope hung from ceiling hooks. The counter was worn smooth from decades of hands. The owner, Thomas Whitaker, stood behind it. He had a missing tip on his left index finger and a habit of tapping that hand against the counter whenever he was thinking. He looked at the hinge Elena placed before him. "You are working on the Vale place." It was not a question. Yes. Thomas turned the hinge over. Most people would have torn it down. I am not most people. A small smile appeared, then disappeared. No. I suppose you're not. Elena expected a price. Instead, Thomas opened a drawer and pulled out a thin manual with a faded green cover. Old repair notes. Someone left it here years ago. I cannot afford extra. Then do not buy it. She looked at him. I am not asking you for charity, Elena said. Thomas pushed the manual closer. Good. Neither am I. He wrote her name on a small card behind the counter. I will keep an account. Pay when you can. Elena looked at the card. Why? Thomas glanced toward the window. Because that building survived longer than most people expected. Before she left, he added one more thing. Read the chapter on old chimneys first. The next morning, Elena returned with the manual and purchased what she needed. 2 pounds of iron nails, $1.20. A stiff brush, 35 cents. A small tin of chimney sealant, 80 cents. Cotton work gloves, 45 cents. A bundle of kindling, 60 cents. A measuring tape, 90 cents. The numbers were small, but every purchase felt deliberate. She wrote each one in a notebook because every coin represented a choice. The chimney became her first serious challenge. The bricks on the lower section were weakened by years of moisture. When Elena touched the mortar joints, fine powder fell between her fingers. Creosote had collected inside the flue, forming dark layers that prevented proper airflow. She spent 2 full days removing debris. First, she covered the hearth with canvas. Then she lowered a weighted brush through the chimney opening and worked downwards slowly, turning the handle one section at a time. She repeated the process until the loose creosote stopped falling. The work was dirty. Her hair carried the smell of smoke before there was any fire. Her hands became black around the nails. For 6 hours on the second afternoon, she sat on the roof edge, scraping hardened residue from the upper stones with a narrow metal tool. She did not rush because she remembered Beatrice's hands moving across delicate thread. Careful work was still work. The first fire came after sunset on the 7th day. Elena placed 3 small pieces of dry wood inside the hearth and watched the flame grow. At first, she expected smoke to fill the room. It did not. The chimney pulled steadily. Warm air moved through the studio for the first time in decades. She cooked a simple meal of beans and bread in a small iron pot. It was not a feast. It was the first meal she made in a place that belonged to her. The following week, she began sorting the workroom. She did not search for hidden things. She looked for what had been left behind. On the western shelf, she found 6 lace pillows with different patterns pinned into their surfaces. Beneath them was a box of brass pins arranged by size. Near the window sat a wooden stand holding dozens of bobbins, each one carved differently by hand. In the corner was an unfinished linen panel wrapped in cloth. Beside it rested a small notebook with water-stained pages. The objects were not valuable because they were old. They were valuable because someone had touched them every day. At the back of the room, Elena noticed something strange. One of the thread windows sounded different. The machine was made from cherrywood, polished smooth by years of use. Most of it was solid. But when Elena tapped the central shaft, the sound changed. A hollow note. She stopped. She tapped again. The same sound. The wooden piece weighed slightly less than it should have. The grain pattern also seemed wrong. There was a circular seam hidden beneath the darker edge of the shaft. Elena cleaned the area carefully. A small cedar disc appeared. It had been fitted so precisely that she almost missed it. Her hands became slower. She removed the disc. Inside the hollow space were 3 wrapped packages, each protected by layers of old linen. The first contained tools, not ordinary tools, but small handmade instruments used for lacework. A silver needle case, brass measuring pins, wooden bobbins carved with tiny family markings. The second package contained raw linen thread. Hundreds of yards. Still pale. Still usable. The third was a small tin box. Inside were coins. Elena counted them twice. The total was $23,900. There were gold eagles, silver dollars, Indian head pennies, and Liberty Head nickels. Each group had been separated carefully in cloth envelopes. Beneath the coins was a small military medal. The engraving showed the year 1918. The name was worn, but the shape remained clear. Elena did not celebrate. She did not run into town. She did not imagine what money could buy. She placed everything back exactly as she found it. Except the letter. The envelope beneath the medal had handwriting she recognized, not because she had seen it recently, because she had spent her childhood watching those same careful letters appear on recipe cards and thread labels. Beatrice. Elena carried the envelope outside. She sat beside the marsh where the walnut trees reflected in the dark water. The letter remained unopened beside her. For that night, she only watched the water move. She had spent months chasing answers. Now, for the first time, she allowed something to wait. Some things look like small gestures and turn out to be everything. As morning came slowly through the eastern window, Elena carried the envelope back inside before the first light reached the floorboards. She placed it beside the thread winder, washed her hands, and looked again at the handwriting. The letters leaned slightly to the right, the same careful shape, the same small pauses between words. She had seen that handwriting on jars of preserved fruit, folded recipes, and scraps of linen patterns stored in Beatrice's kitchen drawer. But this was different. This was a letter that had waited. Elena opened it carefully along the old seam. The paper had softened with age but remained whole. The ink had faded in places, yet every line was still readable. My dear one, whoever you are, if these words have reached you, then the house has found another pair of careful hands. My name is Beatrice Vale, though many years ago my family knew me as Beatrice Holloway. I write this from my small room in Salem, Massachusetts, after Dr. Samuel Whitcomb at Salem Hospital confirmed what I already knew from the weakness in my breathing. He called it pulmonary fibrosis. He told me that the scar tissue in my lungs would continue to grow and that I should make peace with a body that could no longer keep pace with my hands. I did not fear the diagnosis. I feared leaving unfinished work. The craft must never disappear because one person becomes tired. My family line began with Eleanor Holloway, born in 1768 in Ipswich, Massachusetts, who learned linen lace from coastal makers after the Revolutionary War. Her daughter Martha Holloway, born in 1796, carried the patterns to her own cottage near Essex County. Martha's son Thomas Vale, born in 1824, repaired the first cherrywood thread winder and recorded the measurements for future generations. My mother, Clara Vale, born in 1857 in Salem, Massachusetts, taught me that every thread carried the memory of the person who guided it. More than 30 years have passed since this trade closed its doors on October 14th, 1891. I have heard the silence since then. The room became quiet. The tools became still. But quiet does not mean forgotten. My husband, Samuel, was taken from me during the First World War. He served with the American Expeditionary Forces and never returned from France in 1918. After that loss, I understood something important. A person can break and still continue making something useful. That is what lace taught me. When you begin a pattern, secure the first linen thread with a knot that does not pull loose under pressure. Keep your bobbins balanced with equal weight so the tension remains even. When working fine linen, keep the room near 65 degrees Fahrenheit because cold air makes the thread less forgiving. For a strong edge, cross and twist each pair 3 times before moving the pin. Do not hurry because speed creates mistakes that patience would have prevented. The work is not difficult because it is complicated. The work is difficult because it asks you to remain present. The tools hidden in the thread winder are not payment. They are a beginning. The money beside them is not a reward. It is a responsibility. Use only what you need. Leave enough for someone who may arrive after you with nothing but determination and a pair of willing hands. Inheritance is not measured by what sits in a box. It is measured by what survives because someone chose to continue. If you're reading this, then perhaps you know what it feels like to lose a place in the world. I knew that feeling. I lost my husband. I lost my strength. I watched my children leave for distant towns, but the work remained, the house remained. And now you remain. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You're welcome here. Beatrice Eleanor Vale, March 3, 1921. Elena read the letter once. Then again. The second time, she followed every line with her finger, stopping at the places where the ink had faded. When she finished, she folded the paper along the original creases. Not new folds. Not easier ones. The old ones, the ones Beatrice had made. She carried the letter through the back door. Behind the studio, beyond the grass and the walnut trees, stood a small wooden marker half covered by moss. Elena cleared the ground with her hands. The name was simple, Beatrice Vale. No grand stone. No explanation. Just a person remembered in the place where she had worked. That afternoon, Elena cleaned the old brass lantern from the workroom shelf. She polished the metal slowly until the surface caught the light again. Then she lit it. The flame was small, but it stayed. Over the following days, Elena began noticing the people who had quietly helped her survive the first weeks. Margaret Ellis at the clerk's office left a folder of old property records on the counter and told her nothing was owed. Thomas Whittaker kept her account open and placed a repaired hand plane beside the register without saying where it came from. Samuel Reed, the neighbour on the road, stopped one morning with a sack of firewood and simply pointed toward the empty woodpile. 3 people, 3 small actions. None of them asked to be remembered. Sometimes the smallest kindnesses arrive without announcing themselves. Before we continue, take a moment and think about this. What is one small kindness someone once gave you that you still remember years later? It does not have to be something expensive. It does not have to be something dramatic. Sometimes a person simply leaves a door open when you have nowhere else to go. That evening, Elena placed the heirloom tools beside her blanket. The letter rested beneath the lantern. The medal remained wrapped in cloth. She slept beside the objects that had crossed generations to reach her, and for the first time since leaving her old life behind, the future did not feel like something she had to chase. It felt like something she could build, The first snow arrived on December 2nd, 2024. By sunrise, 4 inches covered the grass around the studio, filling the gaps beneath the damaged roofline with cold white powder. Elena stood inside the workroom and watched small drops of melted snow fall onto the floor. She opened Beatrice's repair manual again. She read the roofing chapter 3 times. Not because she could not understand it, because old instructions carried the same patience as old hands. The roof measured 30 feet by 20 feet. Elena calculated the materials carefully. She needed approximately 18 bundles of cedar shingles, 3 rolls of roofing felt, and nearly 2,000 galvanized nails to replace the damaged sections. The numbers looked large. The work looked larger. But she began. Thomas Whitaker noticed the old roofing tools she carried into town and disappeared into the back room. When he returned, he placed a worn leather hatchet on the counter. My uncle used this. Elena looked at the handle. The wood was dark from decades of use. I cannot pay for it. Thomas shook his head. Then do not. A week later, an older man named Walter Finch arrived at the studio carrying a small toolbox. He had spent 40 years repairing roofs across Essex County. His shoulders were bent, but his eyes were precise. I heard you were trying to save the old place. Elena nodded. I can help. I cannot afford a contractor. Walter looked at the roof. Good. I am not one anymore. He worked beside her for 11 days. They replaced the damaged sections 1 piece at a time. Walter showed her how to check a sister rafter before adding weight, how to snap a chalk line without wasting movement, and how to set each nail with 3 controlled strokes. On the 6th morning, Elena struck a nail too hard. Walter looked over. That nail's proud. Elena removed it. Pull it. They did not speak much after that. By mid-December, the roof held. The studio no longer whispered with every change in weather. It stood. The chimney demanded more patience. When Elena removed the damaged outer bricks, pieces fell away like dry leaves. The mortar had lost its strength. Some bricks had begun to spoil from years of freezing and thawing. She rebuilt slowly. The new mortar used hydraulic lime mixed with fine sand and fire clay in a careful ratio that matched the old construction. She worked in temperatures that stayed mostly in the 20s Fahrenheit, warming her hands every 15 minutes because the cold made her fingers stiff. The repair took 3 weeks. Some mornings, she could not feel her fingertips. She would stop, step inside, place her hands near the stove, then return outside. The chimney did not become new. That was never the goal. It became sound. In late January, Elena lit the test fire. She watched the smoke rise. Then she watched it disappear cleanly through the repaired flue. No hesitation. No backdraft. Only a steady pull toward the sky. The floors revealed the years better than any photograph. Beneath the dust were white pine planks marked by footsteps from generations of lace makers. Some boards still held hand-cut rosehead nails that caught the light when Elena cleaned around them. She rented a random orbit sander from town for $14 a day. The work required 3 passes. 80 grit first, then 120. Then 220. Each pass changed the room slowly. The dark surface became lighter. The old honey colour returned. After sanding, Elena applied 3 coats of oil finish, waiting between each layer and allowing the final coat 48 hours to cure. By the end, the floor had shifted from years of darkness into a deep shade between honey and mahogany. But one morning, she did not work. The sky was grey. The tools were ready. The floor waited. Elena walked outside instead and sat near the marsh. A great blue heron stood motionless beside the water. For several hours, she watched it move only when necessary. That day, she did no repairs. She simply stayed. The windows were the most delicate work. There were 8 in total. 3 had no glass remaining. 4 had cracks running through the panes. 1 survived almost untouched. The original pane from 1788 remained in its frame, thin and slightly uneven, carrying the marks of old glass-making methods. Elena preserved it. The others required careful restoration. She used DAP 33 glazing putty, warming it between her fingers before pressing it into the wooden frames. She replaced damaged sash cord with 1/4-inch cotton cord and tied each counterweight using a figure-8 knot so the movement remained balanced. The last window took 2 days. When Elena finished, she cleaned the glass and stepped back. The studio looked outward again. Outside, a small chickadee landed on a walnut branch. It tilted its head toward the restored window. Then it flew away. The walls revealed their own history after the windows were repaired. Behind the damaged sections was hand-split oak lath, uneven but carefully placed by someone who understood the value of strong foundations. Near the chimney, 3 patches had failed completely. Each old repair had cracked in the same place where heat and cold met. Elena removed the loose material and began again. The new mixture followed the old method. Lime plaster, fine sand, horsehair from an old bag Thomas Whitaker had kept in the back of his hardware store. The first scratch coat was pressed into the oak lath and scored so the next layer could hold. The brown coat followed at 3/8 of an inch and rested for 72 hours before the final finish coat of 1/8 inch was applied. The work was slow. It required waiting between each step. When the final surface dried smooth beside the chimney, Elena placed her hand against it. These patches will hold another 100 years. She did not say it proudly. She said it like a promise. By March, the studio was no longer invisible to the people nearby. Doris from the Old Lantern Cafe was the first to appear regularly. She was a small woman with silver curls always tucked beneath a blue scarf. Each Thursday morning, Elena found 2 paper bags sitting on the doorstep. Bread, soup, sometimes a small pastry. When Elena brought money to the cafe, Doris waved it away. When the shop reopens, pay me in candles. She smiled and returned to her work. A week later, a teenager arrived on an old Schwinn bicycle. His name was Caleb. The bicycle chain clicked with every turn, and a splitting maul rested across the back rack. I heard you needed wood. Elena reached for her wallet. He shook his head before she opened it. No, Caleb, I should pay you. He looked toward the studio. My mother said, about your grandfather. That was all he explained. He helped split the remaining firewood, stacked it beside the wall, and left before sunset. Reverend Boyd passed the property every morning. He was tall, thin, and carried a worn leather Bible under one arm. He never stopped for long. He simply tipped his hat. And one morning, before continuing down the road, he offered 4 quiet words. May your hands endure. Elena waited until February 11th before opening the cellar entrance. The delay was deliberate. She wanted the rest of the building to become stable before disturbing the oldest part beneath it. The cellar measured 12 by 15 feet, with a fieldstone floor and 7 granite steps leading downward. The air below was colder, carrying the smell of earth and stone. At the centre stood a dressed granite slab. A small craft mark had been carved into its surface. Elena traced the symbol with her finger. She did not lift it. Some things did not need to be opened immediately. While clearing the 3rd step, she found a small oak box wedged behind the stone. Inside was a brass key. The bow of the key was shaped like the symbol used by the lace makers of the family. There was also a tintype photograph. The image showed a young woman standing outside the cottage in 1903. She held a familiar tool. Her face was not identical to Elena's, but the resemblance was impossible to ignore. On the back, written in faded ink, Beatrice Holloway, daughter of Eleanor Holloway, age 25, summer of 1903. Elena carried the key upstairs. She placed it on the mantel. She did not know what it opened. She decided that was enough for now. Spring arrived quietly. The snow withdrew from the fields. The creek beside the walnut trees grew louder each morning. Green catkins appeared on the branches above the studio. Elena could have begun making full lace pieces immediately. She had the tools. She had the money. She had the history. But she remembered Beatrice's words. The work asked for presence, not speed. That spring, Elena spent only 1 coin from the hidden cash. She bought linen, nothing more. She practiced on small samples beside the eastern window, learning the movement of the old bobbins again. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Elena completed her first full heritage craft piece. It was not large. It was not displayed publicly. It was a narrow lace panel made from fine linen thread, shaped with the same crossing patterns Beatrice had recorded decades earlier. The final edge took her 3 evenings. When she finished, she placed the piece beside the original tools. The old and new rested together. The studio had changed, but it had not lost itself. The roof held against winter storms. The chimney carried warmth. The restored floors reflected morning light. The windows looked toward the walnut trees. The lanterns still burned each evening. The house no longer looked abandoned. It looked cared for. The brass key remained on the mantel until the following winter, when Elena finally noticed the small marking on its handle matched the plate hidden beneath the oldest walnut tree. She cleared the soil carefully. The key fit. Inside the narrow wooden compartment was a folded 48-star American flag and a note written by Beatrice's great-grandmother during the Civil War. The paper was dated August 1864. The note described waiting for news from a family member serving far from home and asked that the flag remain with the family craft tools so future generations would remember both the work and the people who carried it through difficult years. The military medal from the threadwinder was later placed in honor at the Harmony Grove Cemetery on Memorial Day, May 27, 2025, beside other veterans remembered by the community. Elena never spent the hidden money carelessly. Only 3 coins were used. 1 purchased the finest linen she could find. 1 repaired an original lace pillow. 1 bought materials for teaching. The remaining money returned to the sealed compartment. A note rested beside it. For the next one, the shop reopened quietly. There was no announcement, no ceremony. Only a handwritten index card placed on the cafe corkboard. Bobbin Lace Workroom. Small classes available. BY appointment. Within months, more than 40 names appeared on Elena's mailing list. People who wanted to learn. People who wanted to remember. People who simply wanted to sit in a room where careful work still mattered. One afternoon, Caleb returned. He was older now and carried a wooden sign he had carved himself. The letters were simple. Vale Lace Workroom. Daughters. Elena touched the carved words. She did not correct him. She hung the sign above the door. Years after opening Beatrice's letter, Elena wrote one of her own. She began with the same words. My dear one, whoever you are. She wrote about the repaired roof, the walnut trees, the first student who learned to move the bobbins without fear. She wrote that every person eventually inherits something. Not always property. Not always money. Sometimes only the responsibility to keep a small light burning. Some things look like small gestures and turn out to be everything. The final pages of Elena's letter were placed beside the original one. Not as a replacement, as another thread. The property had never been waiting for someone wealthy. It had never been waiting for someone famous. It had been waiting for someone willing to listen. The Bobbin Lace Studio waits. It has always waited. And in the clerk's office downtown, inside an old wooden drawer, Margaret Ellis kept one small reminder of where the story began. A folded $9 bill. The same bill Elena carried when she arrived. The same bill that bought a forgotten room. The same bill that proved some beginnings do not look like beginnings at all.